Salam, peace be upon you. Imagine you are walking through a vast, old city at night. One of those cities with twisting streets, hidden courtyards, and ancient stone that still remembers footsteps. You are not lost exactly. You have a sense of direction. But every few minutes, the streets split, and you have to choose left alley or right alley, stairs or bridge, narrow passage or open square. Now, here's the strange thing. You keep a notebook. You mark down one simple number at each place you stand. Call it the lift of the phase, phi tilde, an unwrapped reading of the circular mark phi. And you also mark how that number changes when you take a small step. Call that change word A, defined as A equals D of phi tilde. You are trying to learn the city by learning how your readings behave. And then, sooner or later, you notice a question that is so basic it feels almost childish. If I start here, walk around the block, and return to the exact same stone, should my notebook agree with itself? Should the world let a careful walker come back to the starting point and find that the book has magically changed? This question is not philosophy. It is the beginning of grammar. Because a language that cannot keep its own story consistent is not a language. It is noise. And the holophase language, at this depth, is not about what happened in the universe, or why it happened, or what forces exist. It is about what it even means to say something without contradicting yourself. That is the heart of Part 15, Integrability and Commutativity Grammar. The universe's promise of consistency, spoken in the strict PS0 language of phi, its lift phi, the first change word A, finite jets, and the honest domain where those sentences are allowed. We have already built the earlier pieces that make this part possible. We installed phi as the single primitive, a cyclic order mark, not a substance. We installed x as minimal support, the bare permission to localize. We forbade absolute phase by the gauge rule. We demanded regularity typing. You only speak to the derivative depth your patch licenses. We demanded the phase lift discipline. Calculus is performed on the lift phi, and derivatives must be invariant under adding 2 pi times an integer to the lift. We demanded cut honesty. Branch cuts are bookkeeping. Invariance cannot depend on where you drew the cut. We defined A as the first derivative word. A equals D of phi. We froze finite jets as the alphabet. J to the n of phi is the finite stack of derivatives up to order n at a point. And every sentence must cite n and its domain. We froze public local sentence form. A local claim is O of x equals f of j to the n of phi of x, on a declared domain, with explicit guards. We froze transformation grammar. On overlaps, jets transform by the chain rule. Meaning is the equivalence class, not the coordinate spelling. We froze triunity. Omega, kappa, and nu are inseparable readouts of the same A, never independent primitives. Now, with all that in place, integrability is not a new idea we add. It is the discipline that prevents the language from tearing itself apart. Because the moment you allow derivatives, you have invited a dangerous freedom. You can approach the same point in many ways, differentiate in many orders, circle around in many small loops. If your language gives different answers depending on the order of legitimate steps, your language cannot be public. It becomes private hallucination. So part 15 is where we install a rule that sounds like mathematics, but is actually the simplest demand any honest language can make. On a smooth lift-valid domain, calculus must behave. That is not a belief about nature. It is a definition of what it means to be speaking coherently inside the smooth domain. Let's make that feel real. Picture a hillside after rain. You can walk north and the ground rises. You can walk east and it falls. You can describe the hill by a single height value h at each point. If height is real in this sense, if it is a function of position, then you can test a promise. Walk a closed loop. Return to where you started. The total change in height must be zero. If you start at the same stone, you must end at the same height. Otherwise, height was not height. It was something else. A path-dependent record of where you have been, a hidden memory, a trick. This is the most human version of integrability. Closed loops must not manufacture net change. In the holophase language, the object playing the role of height is the lift from, when it exists as a smooth function on the patch. And the object playing the role of slope is the first derivative word a, defined as a equals d of fum. If fum is a well-defined smooth lift on a patch, then a is exact. It came from differentiating something. And an exact derivative has a deep property. When you take the derivative again, you get zero in the sense that matters here. Say it plainly in words. D of phi tilde equals zero. That sentence means the change word A has no curl of curl mystery on a smooth patch because it is literally a derivative of a single valued function there. If you traverse a tiny loop inside that smooth patch, the net phase change measured by A around that loop must vanish. And if it doesn't vanish, you are not allowed to shout, "New force!" You are required, by grammar, to ask a different question. Was I truly inside a smooth lift valid domain? Or did I, without noticing, step near an obstruction, near a defect, boundary, cut, or region of insufficient differentiability, where the very conditions that licensed the sentence were not satisfied? This is why integrability belongs in the language episode, not the dynamics episode. It is not how the universe moves. It is how the universe refuses to let us cheat. Now let's bring in the second phase of integrability, commutativity of mixed partials. Imagine you are tasting a complex dish. You could first taste sweetness and then notice the spice, or first notice the spice and then the sweetness. If the dish is stable, the order in which you pay attention does not change what the dish is. Your attention order changes your experience, not the dish. But if your tasting order changed the chemical composition of the food in your mouth, you would not be learning the dish. You would be altering it by the act of tasting. That would be a different situation entirely. Mixed partial commutativity is the mathematical shadow of the same demand. In a smooth domain, your order of legitimate questioning must not change the answer. In ordinary calculus terms, the second derivative of phi tilde with respect to x, then y, equals the second derivative with respect to y, then x, wherever the function is sufficiently smooth. In plain language, if you measure how a changes in direction 1, and then how that result changes in direction 2, you must get the same as doing it in the opposite order, so long as you are on a domain that is typed smooth enough to permit those derivatives. This is not an extra assumption. It is part of what typed smooth enough means. That brings us to the first of the four gates, because part 15 is not only a beautiful story about consistency, it is also a firewall against primitive drift. The well-formedness gate here is simple and strict. If you are speaking on a domain that you declared as smooth and lift valid, then commutativity is required. Period. You don't get to discover non-commutation inside a smooth lift valid domain as though it were a new noun in the universe. If your derivatives fail to commute there, one of your declarations was false. Either the domain was not smooth at the required order, or the lift was not valid in the way you assumed, or your overlap grammar was broken, or you crossed an obstruction you did not type. This gate does something profound. It turns many apparent mysteries into diagnosis. It says, if the bookkeeping doesn't balance, suspect the bookkeeping, not the world. Think of double entry accounting. If you add the debits and credits and they don't match, You don't invent a new kind of money that only appears in the difference. You audit your ledger. You check whether you recorded something twice or forgot an entry or used inconsistent rules. Integrability is double entry bookkeeping for calculus. Now the invariance gate. Even if integrability seems violated, you must be able to say what that means in a way that survives redescription. Because the holophase language is allergic to coordinate ghosts, it does not allow effects that appear only because you changed your chart or moved your cut. So the invariance gate here says, if you see a violation, route it to obstruction typing, defect, branch, boundary, or mistyped domain, rather than declaring a new primitive. In other words, if d of d of phi tilde is not zero, do not treat d of d of phi tilde as a new fundamental object of nature inside PS0. Treat it as evidence that you are not in the smooth, lift-valid story you thought you were in. This is one of the quiet miracles of the holophase approach. It refuses to mistake cracks in our local description for new furniture in reality. And now the domain gate. The domain gate is the honest label on the bottle. Integrability claims only apply where they are allowed. If you want to talk about second derivatives, your patch must be typed at least C2 smooth, differentiable enough for second derivatives to exist in the licensed way. If you're only typed C1, you can speak the first derivative word A, but you cannot speak the second derivative layer as though it were present. If you try, you are not exploring new physics. You are speaking unlicensed sentences. So the domain gate for part 15 is only make commutativity claims on declared smooth domains, only where the lift exists, only where the differentiability type licenses it. And if you want to speak about persistent violation, your first responsibility is to check the domain. Are you near a defect set sigma, a boundary B, a declared cut, or a region where the smooth typing fails? Now the non-encodability challenge. This is the temptation we are guarding against. Someone finds a persistent non-commutation and says, aha, this is a new force, this is a new field, this is a new primitive. The PS0 language responds with a calm, brutal question. Can you express what you are calling new as a statement about domains, obstructions, jets, and topology? If yes, then it is not a new primitive. It is a grammatical diagnosis. If no, then you must prove non-encodability. Prove that your proposed new primitive cannot be rewritten as any PS0 invariant constraint on finite jets and topology. This is an extremely high bar. And the purpose is not to block creativity, it is to preserve honesty. The language remains minimal until the world forces it to expand. Now let's return to the story level, because integrability is one of those places where the most profound physics feels like a moral instruction. Do not lie to yourself about consistency. Picture again the city at night. You stand in a small square. You take a step north, then east, then south, then west, returning to the same stone. You measure A along each segment, how F changes along each tiny move, and you add up what you recorded around the loop. If you are inside the smooth, lift-valid district of the city, the sum should be zero. You come back with no net phase change, because you came back to the same point, and the lift is single-valued there. If the sum is not zero, something is wrong with your claim of being inside that district. Maybe you crossed a place where the lift secretly jumps by 2 pi times an integer because your cut bookkeeping changed. But if you declared your cut honestly and treated it as bookkeeping, your invariance must not depend on where you drew it. So the non-zero loop sum must be telling you something else. Maybe the district contains a hole you didn't notice, a region you should have excised, so the loop is not contractible in the clean domain. In that case, non-zero loop memory is not a contradiction. It is topology speaking. It is the city reminding you, Your loop enclosed something. This is where integrability meets the deeper holophase theme. Closure creates integers, and obstructions create memory. But in part 15, we are not doing the full topology chapter yet. We are installing the rule that lets topology be meaningful later. The rule is, on truly smooth, lift-valid patches, loops don't accumulate net derivative change. If they do accumulate, you are not in that patch. You are near something that must be typed. Now bring in triunity. Triunity is the constant reminder that omega, kappa, and nu are not separate beings. They are three readouts of the same A, the first change word. They are shadows cast by one object. Integrability is the stitch that keeps those shadows welded. Because if omega and kappa and nu were independent primitives, you could change one without changing the others. You could make purely temporal modifications that do not affect spatial texture, or purely spatial modifications that do not affect transport. But the holophase claim is that these separations are projections, readings, not independent foundations. So what does integrability do here? It says, if you attempt to vary one readout while holding the underlying A fixed, you will fail, because the readout is not independent of A, it is derived from A. More sharply, any sentence that speaks about omega alone must be rewritable as a sentence about A. If it is not rewritable, it was not a PS0 sentence. It smuggled in a primitive. And integrability adds something even stronger. The consistency of higher derivatives prevents you from inventing an omega-only twist that cannot be recomposed into the same A on overlaps without violating commutativity. This is the triunity weld. The calculus grammar keeps the three readouts from drifting apart into three stories. Now let's make integrability vivid across scales, because this is where the listener should feel that the same grammar appears everywhere, not as mysticism, but as a universal discipline of consistency. Start with everyday life. You make two promises for Saturday. Promise 1. You will help a friend move. Promise 2. You will attend the wedding. If you try to apply both promises in the same domain of time, they may not commute. The order you try to fulfill them matters. You cannot do both fully. That is not a new substance. That is a domain conflict. The smooth story, I can do everything I promise, was typed incorrectly. The reality is that time has boundaries. You need excision. You must remove one commitment or change the domain by moving one event. This is integrability thinking. If the story doesn't close on itself, don't invent a ghost. Check the domain. Now, biology. In a metabolic network, some sequences of reactions lead to the same final molecule regardless of order. Those pathways are integrable in the relevant sense. But other sequences produce different outcomes because enzymes are regulated, compartments exist, and timing matters. That MAMCO mutation is not a new force. It is the organism's domain structure. The cell is telling you, these operations are not freely reorderable because the domain is not smooth and memory-free. Now engineering. In a well-designed conservative system, going around the loop in configuration returns you to the same state without net gain. But if you include a battery, a pump, a motor, something that injects or extracts, then loop integrals are not zero. Again, the violation signals an obstruction to the conservative story. You must type the domain properly. You included a source or a discontinuity. The calculus didn't fail, your assumption did. Now mathematics, but in plain terms. If a function is smooth, the order of taking partial derivatives doesn't matter. If you get a different answer, you are either not differentiating a smooth function, or you are differentiating across a corner, cusp, jump, or boundary, or you used inconsistent coordinates on overlaps. So integrability is less like a law of physics and more like a contract. If you promise me smoothness and a valid lift, I promise you commutativity and d of d equals 0. If you break your promise, I withdraw mine. This contract is the heart of the grammar. Now we install the formal prediction and the formal falsifier. Remember, inside episode 13b, these must be grammatical, not empirical. The prediction in part 15 is persistent non-commutation is a sign that you are not in a smooth lived valid domain. You are near an obstruction, near a defect set, boundary, or cut, or you mistyped your domain. In other words, the language predicts that when commutativity seems to fail, the correct action is to refine domain declarations and obstruction typing, not to multiply primitives. This is not a claim that nature is always commutative everywhere. It is a claim about what counts as a legitimate sentence in the smooth story. If you find non-commutation, you have learned that the smooth story does not apply there. The falsifier is the corresponding grammatical disaster. Demonstrate stable non-commutation on a certified smooth lift-valid domain while respecting all invariances and without introducing new primitives. That would mean you have a domain that truly satisfies the lift discipline and smooth typing, and yet calculus itself does not behave. That would break the grammar. In the holophase language, that would be like proving that even when you follow the rules of the language perfectly, the language contradicts itself. If such a thing happened, the PS0 language would not be complete as stated. It would have to be revised at the root. That is what makes this part powerful. It is a place where the language puts its own throat on the blade. Either the grammar holds, or the whole project admits defeat and must rebuild. Now let's deepen the picture of what persistent non-commutation looks like without importing forbidden primitives. Think of walking in that city again. In a normal neighborhood, you can take one street north, then east, and arrive at the same corner as east, then north. The paths are different, but the destination is the same. Your coordinate description differs, but the meaning is equivalent. But near a construction zone, near a blocked street, a fence, a guarded boundary, the two orders may not commute. If you go north first, you hit a barrier and must detour. If you go east first, you pass through before the barrier. The city becomes order dependent. What happened? Did the city invent a new type of space? No. You approached the boundary. The domain changed. This is how commutativity fails in practice. You have assumed smooth access where there is obstruction. In holophase, the obstruction might be a defect, a branch-cut region, a boundary of differentiability, or a region where the lift cannot be defined consistently. The construction fence is whatever forces you to excise or retype. Integrability grammar says, do not pretend the fence is not there. Either avoid it, stay in the smooth domain, or type it honestly. Handle topology and excision later. Now, what does this do for the entire holophase language? It gives us a way to keep infinite richness without infinite confusion. Because the moment we allow higher jets, second derivatives, third derivatives, and beyond, we multiply the number of questions we can ask about how change changes. Without integrability, those questions can become inconsistent. You could ask them in different orders and get incompatible answers. And then, instead of a language, you have a swarm of incompatible dialects. Integrability is the rule that says, the deeper you go, the more you must respect the consistency stitches. Otherwise, the structure tears. And this is where the beauty emerges. Holophase does not say, the universe is simple. It says, the universe is readable, and readability demands discipline. It says, You can ask infinitely many derivative questions in principle, but the questions must compose. They must glue on overlaps. They must commute where smoothness and lived validity are declared. And where they see non commutation, the correct interpretation is not mystery, but map. You have found a boundary, an obstruction, an excision you must acknowledge. Integrability turns apparent contradictions into cartography. Now let's state the core of part 15 as a single coherent image the listener can carry. Picture the entire holophase language as a woven carpet. Phi is the raw thread, the cyclic dye running through everything. The lift F is like temporarily unspooling the thread on a small patch so you can measure length and direction without losing the circular pattern. A equals D of F is the first visible weave direction, the first public how it changes. Finite jets are the increasingly fine weave patterns, not new threads, but finer questions about how the thread bends and turns. Triunity is the fact that the weave has three inseparable aspects: cadence, texture, and transport. Three ways the same weave announces itself. Now, integrability is the rule that the weave must actually close. It must not tear. It must not claim the pattern is consistent while hiding a mismatch. In a smooth region of the carpet, if you trace a tiny loop with your finger, you come back with no net mismatch. The pattern closes, the stitches align. That is, D of D equals 0. And if you move your finger in one order, up then right, and then in the other order, right then up, the local weave you infer is the same. That is commutativity of mixed partials. But near a knot, a seam, a repair, an intentional defect in the design, your tracing reveals a mismatch. Not because the carpet is wrong, but because the carpet contains structure that your smooth weave assumption cannot flatten. The mismatch is information. It tells you there is a knot, a seam, a boundary. Integrability is the promise of closure where closure is allowed, and the signal of obstruction where it is not. That is the discipline. Now, a final tightening, so the part remains inside PS0 and does not drift. We do not here introduce dynamics. We do not speak of laws of motion. We do not speak of forces as primitives. We do not speak of energy as substance. Energy, if mentioned, remains a tally, a report derived later from patterns, not a thing we pour into equations. We speak only of grammar, what it means for second jet and higher jet sentences to be consistent. And now we seal the part with the one sentence the listener should carry forward. On a smooth lift valley domain, the change of change is consistent. D of phi tilde equals 0. And mixed partials commute. When they do not, you have not found a new primitive. You have found an obstruction, and the map of the domain must be corrected. That is part 15. And it naturally hands us to what comes next: the formal act of declaring the clean domain where derivative sentences live, the excise domain, so we can speak with full honesty about where calculus grammar applies and where topology and obstruction grammar must take over. Because the deepest beauty of this language is that it never pretends. Where the world is smooth, it is smooth. Where it is not, the language does not cover it with metaphors. It marks the boundary and says, here, a different sentence type is required. That is how a language stays true. Always. Peace be upon you.